Good morning and welcome to 20 Minutes on Fighting Disinformation. Today we will be turning a bit the coin from the usual topics that we have had on this series. Today we'll be looking at the receiving end of information and to what extent the viewer consumer is ready to take rational decisions when it comes to the information that they receive. Steve Sloman, that's with us today, he offers several reasons to reject the view that the brain is rational in processing information. And the main one is that people aren't particularly interested in the truth. They're interested in channeling their communities. And he will draw out some implications for how to understand and what to do about fake news. So Steve Sloman is a professor of cognitive, linguistic, and psychological sciences. He has taught at Brown University since 1992, and in 2017 he created the Behavioral Decision Sciences concentration and is currently concentration advisor. He has published widely on the topic. So for those wishing to go more in depth after today's topic, there's plenty to read. So Steve, with that brief introduction, please let us hear from your research.
Well, great. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Let me share my slides. Okay, so there's this standard view in cognitive science that I think has made its way into the public that the way human beings acquire information is through this set of boxes, the set of processing stages. So information, including news, comes into the system and then gets processed in particular ways, might enter short-term memory, might then enter long-term memory. And all of this, of course, happens in the brain. So that's the standard view of information processing by cognition. And some implications of this view are that we should think about people as being a lot like computers. That is, they take in information, process it, retain and output the outcomes. And the whole process assumes that there's a kind of rationality to how humans process information. After all, there's a kind of rationality to how computers process information. A second implication of this view is that information, of course, is processed in the brain. In other words, people are individual processors of information. An important implication of this position, and one that I think is assumed not only by cognitive scientists and psychologists, but by people at large, is what we might call the deficit model. So the deficit model says that when there are problems in the processing of information, for instance, people accepting information that is false, like fake news, or people believing things that are inconsistent with scientific orthodoxy, the idea is that, well, this is true because people don't know enough. There's a deficit in our knowledge. And you can see how foundational this assumption is in our society, in that we talk about things like information bubbles. And the whole notion of an information bubble is that it's information that's critical. If you could only have the information from outside your bubble, then all problems would be rectified. Or the notion that we can solve society's problems through information campaigns. If we could simply give people the right information, then all problems would be resolved. Or the notion that we can fix some of society's problems, like get people to disregard fake news by giving them critical reasoning skills, by teaching critical reasoning skills. All of these ideas assume the deficit model. They assume that knowledge is what's critical to good social behavior. I'd like to argue that this whole story is just wrong. that these are not the critical processes that determine how people, what people believe. So how do people actually process news? Well, let me make a couple of points about this. So first of all, I'd like to let you know about some critical ideas by an excellent social psychologist at Harvard University named Daniel Gilbert, who long ago asked the question, when we accept information versus reject information, are those two processes symmetric? Are they the same? And what Dan Gilbert did was to pit two different views against one another. The first he calls the Cartesian view after René Descartes. And this is kind of the standard view of how we accept and reject information. That is, first we comprehend information, and then we decide whether to accept it or not. So we read a news story and we make sense of it, and then we decide whether it's true or not. And if it's true, it enters into our stock of knowledge, and if it's false, it doesn't. He contrasts that with what he calls the Spinozan view. So Baruch Spinoza suggested that there's actually an asymmetry in how we accept and reject information. When we understand something, the natural thing to do is just accept it. If we're going to reject it, then we have to go through another separate process, and one that we don't usually bother with. So for instance, if we see that it's raining outside, then we believe that it's raining. Simply understanding what's happening outside our window is enough for us to believe. We don't have to go through a process of deciding whether or not it's raining. But if we think that it's a hologram or something, then we might go through a secondary process to reject what we're seeing. Or if somebody tells us that the election was stolen, then normally we'll just understand the sentence, and by virtue of understanding it, we'll accept it. Of course, if we don't believe it, then we can go through another secondary effortful process in order to reject it. So it turns out Spinoza was right and Descartes was wrong. There's lots of evidence in the psychological laboratory to suggest that. And so what this means is that we should think about the process of understanding as the process of believing, right? We believe what we're told, essentially, unless we go through this extra effortful process of neglecting. The second implication is that we don't usually care about the source of information. We care about the information itself. We just believe what we're told without evaluating whether the source was believable, was credible or not. Okay, that's the first point about how we actually process news. The second, I'll introduce by reference to what we call the knowledge illusion. That's the title of a book I wrote with Phil Fernbach. We might also think of it as the illusion of understanding. So there's evidence from the psychological laboratory that people do not understand things as well as they think they do. And the form of this evidence is you ask people how well they understand a common object, and like a toilet, and people think they understand how they work. But when you ask them to explain how they work, they discover that in fact they don't understand. They can't articulate how they work at all. And so that lowers their sense of understanding. And my colleagues and I showed that this is also true in the political domain. So if you ask people how well they understand a policy and its implications, people say, oh, I understand it pretty well. But then when you ask them to explain it, it turns out they can't explain it at all. And that not only reduces their sense of understanding, it also reduces their confidence in their attitude. So we can reduce polarization in a group simply by asking understanding, by asking people to explain their understanding. It turns out that asking people to give you reasons they believe something does not have this effect. What's critical is that you ask people to provide a causal explanation for how the policy will lead to outcomes. Not why they believe the policy, but how it will lead to outcomes. So what this evidence suggests is that we live in this illusion of understanding. We think we understand things better than in fact we do. Why should we live in such an illusion? Well, the reason I'd like to suggest is because we fail to distinguish the knowledge in our heads from the knowledge in other people's heads. We think we understand how toilets work because plumbers understand how toilets work, and plumbers are in our community, so we have access to all this knowledge about how toilets work. Similarly with political policies. We ourselves may not have the information in our heads, but we have access to it through our community. And because we have access to the information, it may as well be in our heads. So we fail to distinguish what's in our heads from what's in the heads of the other members of community, because it turns out it's not actually a really important distinction. So what this suggests is that we should think about thought not as something that goes on inside the skull, but as something that goes on in a community, since we house most of our knowledge in the community. And for what it's worth, this explains why so much political debate today is so emotional. Because when people challenge us, we're not defending our own personal position, we're defending our community's position. And when we're defending our community, it's much closer to our hearts than when we're defending ourselves individually. There's a lot more to be said about this. It has a long history in philosophy, but I'm going to move on since I have such limited time. How relevant is this to our understanding of the news, true news and fake news? Well, so the way to think about the acquisition of information in the news is that we apply a narrative to it, right? So we understand things by virtue of prior knowledge we bring to bear, although a lot of this knowledge is not actually knowledge in our heads, but knowledge in our community. So we do this by appealing to a narrative. A narrative is something that reflects not only a little bit of information I have in our head, but something that my community accepts, right? A narrative is a social entity. And so the narrative represents our social identity. And when we're encountering information, we see to what extent it fits into this narrative that belongs to my social community. And indeed, there's a ton of evidence that's consistent with this. That's consistent with this notion that we make policy-related judgments along community lines. Let me just very briefly mention some that come from my own recent research. So I did a study with Mugerjian and Nat Rab in which we looked at what predicts people's willingness to engage in COVID preventive behaviors, right? Like mask wearing and social distancing and getting vaccinated. And it turned out that the single best predictor of people's willingness to engage in these things was their political ideology. Their knowledge about COVID and COVID transmission was the second best predictor. The best predictor in the States, in the US, was political ideology. And, I would bet a fair amount of money that this finding would be true in many other countries in the world as well. Similarly, with some other colleagues, we showed that people's perception of their own risk and their actual risk for COVID, like their age and whether they have immunodeficiencies, does not predict whether they wear masks or socially isolate in the States. What predicts it is their political partisanship. In other words, we think through our communities, even when we're talking about actions that could determine our futures, that could determine whether we live or die, like COVID. Okay, so what this view suggests is what I call the outsourcing hypothesis. When we're asked to make a difficult judgment, one strategy is to avoid the judgment by simply outsourcing it to our community of knowledge. I believe we do this all the time. Let me describe a very simple experiment which makes this point that I did with Marc-Louis Vives. So we had one group of people who were told what I have on the left here. They were told a group of congressmen, this is in the US, began drafting a bill to spend more money on highways. Policy researchers examine their plan, but they do not yet understand the impact it will have. Their current model has not been designed to explain this policy. Okay, so there's this policy, but the researchers don't understand it. How well do you understand it? And there's kind of a right answer here, right? When we ask people how well they understand it, they should say, well, I don't understand it at all. After all, the researchers themselves don't understand it. Another group, we say, same thing, there's this bill to spend more money on highways. In this case, policy researchers do understand it. Their financial model provides a full explanation of its effects. So we're not telling them anything else about anything new about the policy, anything really at all about the policy. We're simply saying researchers understand it. How well do you understand it? And what we find is when the policy researchers understand it, people have a slightly higher sense of understanding than when the policy researchers don't understand it. In other words, it's the understanding of people outside that determines to some extent how well we think we understand it. And not only does our community determine our level of understanding in this sense, it also determines our attitude. So people have a more positive attitude towards the policy when the researchers understand it than when they don't. And in fact, it turns out they're even willing to donate a little more money to a lobby group in favor of the policy when the researchers understand it than when they don't. So this sense of understanding actually matters a great deal. I'll very quickly describe another little study we've done to show one sense in which this sense of understanding that we get from the people around us, the impact it has on our beliefs. So this is work in which we asked people about how they felt about climate change and GMO foods and nuclear power vaccination, a bunch of hot button political topics. And we measured first their knowledge of these topics, and then we asked them what their attitude is. Is it consistent or not with the scientific communities? And what we found is that the more they knew about the topic, the less opposed they were to the scientific community, to the position of the scientific community. So those who knew the most were least opposed, those who knew the least were most opposed. Okay, so that's a little bit of evidence in favor of the deficit model, right? That how much we know determines our political position. It also turns out that people's subjective knowledge, their sense of understanding, had the opposite relation to their degree of opposition. Those who thought they knew the most were the most opposed to the scientific consensus. Those who knew the least, who thought they knew the least, were the least opposed to the scientific consensus. And in fact, we also showed this was true with regard to attitudes towards COVID-19 vaccination and other mitigation and prevention policies. In other words, this is a very general finding. So it's a little bit of support for the deficit model in that general knowledge does predict opposition, but it's also evidence that how much you think you understand is positively related to your degree of opposition. Presumably because your sense of understanding you inherit from the people around you, as opposed to reflecting your true degree of understanding. Okay, so the bottom line for fake news of this, I think, is again that we shouldn't think of human beings as computers who take in information and process it and then output some kind of objective assessment of it. Rather, people find ways to confirm what they already believe. And when I say what they already believe, what I really mean is what their community actually believes, because most of our knowledge sits in our community. And when we think about people's willingness to share fake news, for instance, we shouldn't just think about it as a reflection of a truth that people are trying to pass on to others, but rather an attempt to signal what they want the community to believe. In other words, fake news isn't just a cause of bad information and misinformation in our communities, but it's also an effect. It's something that people use in order to display their agreement or disagreement with a subject matter. So what can we do about the omnipresence of misinformation and disinformation in our society? Well, there are at least two implications of the work that I've just described to you. First of all, it's important to reduce hubris. It's important to let people know that they're not individually in a position to evaluate the underlying assumptions of the fake news that they encounter. If you're told something that assumes that having more immigration hurts job prospects, well, if you have less hubris, then you might be more willing to question the validity of that assumption. How do you reduce hubris? Well, you ask people to explain. You get into a conversation about the consequences of a policy, rather than just discussing the values associated with it. That's the first thing. The second thing is that if we want to combat bad information, we should not merely target facts. Targeting facts has limited value because for the most part, people don't know facts anyway. Rather, what we have to do is target the trustworthiness of the source of the information, so that people will have less faith that they can trust where the information is coming from, that the entity is not a member of their community, and they'll disown it. And that's what I had to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steve. I think that's a lot to take in, and I wish we had more than 20 minutes to listen to you and also have the opportunity to discuss this, because I think this has huge implications for the news media. And you have said before you started that you'll be happy to take any questions by email or by any other means. So if you do have any questions for Steve, let us know, and we'll communicate that. Communicate that to Steve. So today is the last presentation before the summer break, and we are extremely grateful for the many speakers that have contributed towards the series that started back just as the war in Ukraine broke out. And many of you of our speakers have prepared and been very supportive to do so on very short notice. So that's fantastic. Let me remind you that the fight against the mis and disinformation is something that is close to our hearts at Media City Bergen, and we are very excited about the coming week when on Wednesday, the 8th of June, we have our first MCB Fact Conference that's dedicated to the fight on disinformation. And the day after, for those of you that work with innovation, future technologies, and innovation methodology, you are in for a treat with MCB Tech 22. So from all of us at City Bergen, a thank you to all our speakers and for the many newsrooms and other viewers that have been tuning in to watch our talks every Friday morning at 10 o'clock. We wish you a great summer, and we will drop you a line later on when we have more news about our autumn program. So thank you again. Keep safe and stay healthy.